welcome that everybody's here. It's, by the way, very nice to see that many people join these webinar series that are providing knowledge and information on CBAM. Last month we had John Caritas Green from MEPS. Today we have Nick from Carbon Chain. And next month we have also a very interesting speaker, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation. IACBAM is the international association. We focus on sharing knowledge, on certification, and on industry talks. We do that, for example, by research. This was, to me, one of the most interesting researches of the past year with respect to the effect of carbon price paid. We also provide certification on CBAM infrastructure, on declarants, on trainers, and by fundamentals. We see that this is accelerating very fast. A lot of companies struggle with their CBAM processes to make sure that they do the right thing, to not make mistakes in CBAM. And IACBAM trainers can help you with streamlining your business as well, your professional knowledge. IACBAM is joined by more and more partners every week, which you can actually find on the website. This is a little bit of an outdated list. And on the 28th of May in Prague, we're organizing a global CBAM summit with this keynote speaker, Maria Elena Scopio, those of DG Taxit, also Yunho Chang of POSCO, Michael Lund from Damstal, Francesca Cerchia of RGS will speak, and Jan-Joost den Brinker, of course, from Dubrink, and Nick Ogilvie. I look forward to meet you again in Prague of Carbon Chain. I noticed there are only 15 or 20 tickets left. So if you would like to join this event, go to iacbam.org/summit. But today we're here for Nick. I look forward to this webinar, Nick. It's a topic which is currently, I think, one of the most asked about. We get a lot of requests and questions about verification. How does it work? What is necessary? How do suppliers, how does importers see it? And I would like to give you the stage and yeah, bring it on.
Amazing. Thanks, Marcel. Let me just share my screen. So, yeah, well, a very good morning, good afternoon to you all. My name is Nick Ogilvie. I am a product manager and lead our CBAM work here at Carbon Chain. We are a carbon accounting software provider working primarily in the metals and commodities sector to support carbon accounting, both on the CBAM side, but also more broadly around product carbon footprinting and corporate carbon footprinting as well. So today, yeah, I'm going to be talking about probably the most asked question, as Marcel put it, around verification. And really, once you've got a grip of what you're importing and how you're approaching your declarations and your cost hedging and management, understanding that question as to whether or not you can use actuals or whether you're going to be forced into using defaults raises that big question around, okay, what does verification look like, and whether or not I am going to be able to expect to see a verification report coming through from my suppliers some point in 2027. So I maybe just wanted to kind of very quickly touch on the mechanism, just so we can kind of reground ourselves into why verification is so important. So on the left-hand side, under the emissions trading system, there's around 10,000 installations today that are captured and have to report their emissions each year on their processes in order to understand and the EU to set where the benchmarks under the ETS are laid out. And that then determines whether or not you as a producer are in the top 10% most efficient producers, and whether or not you receive a free allocation. Sorry, everyone receives a free allocation, but whether or not your free allocation is sufficient to cover all of your emissions. And if you're above that threshold, you have to purchase additional EUAs on the market to cover those additional emissions. And so the exact same mechanism is operating under EU CBAM, just done via certificates and with an accounting for any carbon price paid overseas. So when you're thinking about verification, when you're thinking about emissions accounting across these supply chains and across complex goods, you know, the question you really have to ask yourselves is what would have happened if all of these goods had been made in the EU and where would the costs have been paid and where would the emissions have been in scope. So the key here is that the only reason the ETS works so efficiently or so effectively is because verification is so strict. And so the rigor that the EU put in place with regards to penalties for failure to meet the verification requirements and the kind of immediacy that they follow up on those penalties is why the ETS and that control around the emissions reporting has been so effective. And so without that same level of rigor under the EU CBAM, you won't have that level playing field between the two mechanisms. And this is really why verification is such a fundamental part of EU CBAM, but also why it's going to be such a challenge, because estimates of around 25 to 50,000 installations producing CBAM goods today that in some way go to the EU. All of those installations would need to undergo verification in order for you as the importer to use actual values instead of default values as part of your declaration. And the same level of rigor with regards to verification will have to be provided to the EU. And they have 5 years to go back and look over that verification and that data in order to assess whether or not they're comfortable with those numbers and if you should face an additional penalty, i.e. using default values, and a potential penalty should it be found that that verification was wrong or the numbers weren't in line with the methodology. So go for it, Marcel, if you have a question. You're on mute, sorry.
I forgot one thing to mention. People can ask questions via the right bottom corner, and at the end of the webinar we will address them.
Amazing, yeah, I'm looking forward to that session. We'll have plenty of time, Ken. Perfect. So we're going to take a look now from the installation perspective and really understand what it looks like and what it feels like to be in installation, and to be in a position where your likelihood of being verified is high, and therefore this can be viewed both from the importer perspective and the installation perspective. So if you are a buyer of CBAM goods, you also want to understand the implications for your suppliers, because if you have a feeling that they're not doing this, then the likelihood of them being able to be verified is going to be low, and therefore the likelihood of you having to use default values is going to be high. So when we think about the timelines for installations, we're now into the definitive period. If the site hasn't set up a monitoring methodology, they need to do that very quickly. That's really the fundamental part of verification. So we'll spend a lot of time on monitoring methodologies today. At the moment, you're likely starting to see 2025 calendar year data surfacing from your suppliers. Some of it will have some benchmark calculations in there. Most of it maybe doesn't, but really pressure them to see how they're getting on with understanding that benchmark implication, and we'll touch on that later as well. Most installations are starting to look for pre-verification or starting to talk to verification providers who are expected to be accredited CBAM verifiers. Getting in early is going to be really important, because the backlog, as I mentioned, with regards to the volume of verification that's going to need to take place in 2027 means you want to start having those conversations with potential verification providers as soon as possible. And then hopefully later in this year, you'll be able to undergo a pre-verification exercise, potentially over your 2025 data or your half-year 26 data, so that you are confident and reduce that time to verification when we go into next year, where in Q1, Q2, the bulk of these verification activities will be taking place, with the objective to meet that 30th of September deadline for the importers to submit their 2026 declarations. And so I think the key thing here is to recognize that 9-month window is going to be very, very tight with regards to completing all of those verifications. So anything you can do this year to get ahead of the game and to give your verifiers confidence that they know what they're going to be looking at when they come and do their on-site visit, when they come and do their review of your monitoring methodology and data, will help you to ensure and give confidence to your customers in Europe that you will enable them to use actual values based on the data that they are receiving from you. So we're going to take a look at these 4 different stages of compliance for installations. The first is around preparing, so understanding what you need to do, what you need to understand about your installation and how CBAM interacts with the site. The next is around the monitoring. So once you've set up the site and defined the different processes and routes and information that you're looking to track for the site, you need to continue to track and monitor and document how you approach that monitoring process. And then as you're collecting and managing that data, we're going through the calculation process with regards to actually understanding what your emissions intensities are, what your benchmarks are, and then potentially where you're going to see deviations with regards to defaults and actuals and any significant changes in your processes on site, and how that might impact your calendar year data for 2026, because your sales team or even your internal kind of management or strategy will be dictated if you're significantly exposed to Europe based on changes in these emissions intensities over the period. And last but not least, obviously the review, which is where, alongside a verifier, you will need to go through this process to make sure that all of your data is aligned with the requirements of the methodology, and therefore you'll be able to pass through verification next year, which will give your customers that right to use actual values in their CBAM declarations. So let's first of all start with the monitoring methodologies. So this is a comprehensive document that will be the first thing that a verifier or a pre-verification exercise provider will ask for. They will want to know everything about what happens on your site, how you quantify and how you measure information that feeds into your calculations, but also then how you set up all of the data quality, the controls, the personnel involved in managing and reviewing the information that's feeding into these calculations on your site. And then last but not least is really this verification pack, which ultimately is what you will again share with your verifier, and they will use that as the basis for conducting their verification exercise. If you think about this in terms of what, maybe a verification exercise that you are familiar with today, which is financial assurance. So every year you prepare your financial reports, you submit them to your auditor or to your accountant, either way, and they will then review the numbers, reconcile the numbers, and then prepare that for a final report. Effectively, this is the same process, with the same level of rigor. We'll see that verification under IACBAM is done to a reasonable assurance level, which is the same as financial assurance, where everything will be drilled into. There will be samples of data taken. It's not just the methodology, it's also the underlying evidence associated with these calculations. So let's talk about the scope and boundaries. We're going to look at this shortly, but ultimately it's understanding of what's happening on your site and how are you impacted by CBAM. So related to the goods that you produce, the precursors that are coming in, the system boundaries that you define, as well as then the underlying processes that take place on your site. The quantification approach really tied to where your numbers are coming from. So how often are you taking meter readings? How are you tracking the input material and the output material from your site? Are you using weighbridges? Do you have an ERP system that's used to track these materials moving through the system? And then how do you manage and control that information? What do your team do in order to reconcile or review or make sure that they're managing the numbers and the information that are feeding through your systems and ultimately making up the information in your final verification pack? And so controls are really important here to make sure that you can evidence, but also then back up with the underlying processes of how you're arriving at this information. And so all of those first three components feed into that verification pack, because ultimately that's the level of granularity and detail that a verifier will want to see when they come on site and look into the information that you have prepared. So when we think about what information you need to know about the site, we're going to look at a couple of terms with regards to CBAM. So the production route is generally this high level route associated with the different aggregated goods categories. So if you are a steel mill or an aluminium smelter, are you operating under a blast furnace route, an electric arc furnace route? Or if you are producing primary or unwrought aluminium, are you a secondary remelter or a primary smelter? These are the production routes which dictate the system boundaries, which capture which components need to feed into the emissions calculation. And then the production process is the more granular site-specific information associated with what actually happens on your site. So yes, you're an electric arc furnace, but talk me through the specific processes in order to produce your end products, and what they go through in order to get to that final point. And so production routes will generally be generic, but then production processes will very much be site specific, and all the quirks associated with your specific production site will be detailed and have to be provided in a kind of flow diagram, for example, for your specific installation. The big question that we hear more and more now is what processes are actually in scope of the legislation. And so when you read through the system boundary confirmations from the EU, the two kind of key ones to call out here are the iron and steel products, and then the aluminium products. And these are where, you know, your production route is just this generic aluminium products or iron and steel products. And actually the underlying processes that matter, and the ones that you as an installation would need to measure and manage emissions associated with, are clearly kind of delineated between those in scope and those out of scope with regards to these activities. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ambiguity in the way that the regulation is written here, particularly with regards to the concept of finishing. So what is finishing? What is included in the scope of finishing? And so when you are looking at your installation, you know, one of the key things is to understand what processes you undertake on the site, and then ideally either speaking to a carbon accounting provider or a verifier to understand whether they would align with you, whether or not your processes are considered finishing and therefore out of scope. And therefore you wouldn't need to report or include the emissions associated with these activities in your data, or you would exclude, or you would need to include them if they were deemed to be in scope. And so there's a big kind of materiality assessment here that should be considered with regards to whether or not you should include these activities, and what the commercial implication is if you do or do not do it, but also just around the data readiness and the preparation on your side. So yeah, lots of questions on that piece, which we're hoping for some additional clarification from the EU on in due course. So when we think about goods moving through the site, and again in your verification pack, you're gonna have to detail all of this information. So all of the final products on the CBAM that you produce, all of the associated precursors in the reporting period that have come into the site, and then all of the additional inputs. So if you're operating, you know, a steel mill and you have some non-precursors, and they're out of scope of CBAM from a CNK perspective, but they're used in your process emissions or your mass balance calculations, for example, making sure that those are incorporated in your monitoring plan, as well as then you will see them going into the calculations for your site. So each one of these components, as you go through the year, will need to be documented and detailed with regards to their origin, how you know the volumes that you're consuming in the period, and then also you know, the volumes that are produced out of the back of these goods from the site. So once you've got a grip of kind of understanding what products you're producing, what materials are coming in, and then you've defined kind of the production processes to which you're able to obtain emissions data, so around the volumes and of natural gas, electricity, for example, you need to determine how you're going to allocate those emissions at your site. And this is really where one of the fundamental pieces of installation accounting comes into play, which is the functional unit. And so if you've ever done product carbon footprinting, the functional unit makes a big difference with regards to how you define and how you allocate emissions on your site. Now, the EU has determined or has said that the default approach for defining functional units is the tons of goods produced under the same CN code. So what this means is that when you look at your final products that you've produced in the period, you will look at their CN codes that you classify them under, and that will be the functional unit to which you would assign all of the precursor emissions, all of the natural gas, electricity, and any other process-related emissions to those goods. And that will be the default approach for you as an installation, and arguably the easiest approach that you can take today with regards to kind of verification and compliance, because it's the simplest way to set your functional unit and allocate all of those emissions and then verify. But also, B, it's also probably easier than having to go down through more complex functional units, such as underlying product names, or as we'll see in a sec, looking at precursor based. But there are very good reasons why you might not want to use the CN code as a functional unit. One of the other kind of key call outs here is that if you're involved in fertilizer or cement production or importation, the functional units are not tons of CO2 per ton. For fertilizers, it's kilograms of nitrogen. And this is really important because the current installation template is not prepared under this functional unit basis. So when you're considering your fertilizer imports, because of the fact that you can concentrate or unconcentrate fertilizers based on the volume of water or other goods, that tons of CO2 per ton, that number can move quite significantly based on the additional components that you add to that fertilizer product, whereas really the emissions embedded in that is generally dictated based on the nitrogen content. So what you'll see, what you should be kind of wary of if you're importing cement or fertilizer, is that the functional unit there from your installations needs to be set on a nitrogen or on a clinker basis, not on a tons of CO2 per ton basis. And the installation templates that we currently have from the EU don't immediately facilitate this today. So something just to really bear in mind when you're reviewing numbers from installations, if you're looking at those two products. The other kind of exemptions, permitted exceptions to this rule around the default grouping, where you're using commodity code as your functional unit, are these two scenarios that are really, really important to understand and are likely going to be used quite comprehensively by specific types of installations. One is where you have unique intensities for a given product under the same commodity code. So, for example, if you're making aluminium plates, but you have unique production processes or unique input materials to those two, you can effectively do lot by lot reporting because of that deviation associated with the emissions intensities in the goods, provided you pass the commercial rationale test, i.e. you have potentially different commercial values associated with those different products, but also B, you have to be able to provide full traceability of those goods through your site. Generally, when we think about iron and steel, aluminium sectors, most of these businesses do have that traceability with regards to product defect issues or any kind of claims associated with those products, and they can prove all the way back down the supply chains exactly where the origin of that product come from. But it very much depends on where you are in that complex goods supply chain. If you're making aluminium plates or rolled products, fine. But if you're at the other end where you're producing fasteners or more even further complex goods, do you really know which origin steel mill the material that's gone into that good has come from? And at that point, then you need to ask the question around whether or not I'm able to use that approach with regards to separating intensities, applying that commercial rationale test, or whether I am in a much safer space with regards to being able to be verified and reducing the cost of verification, because obviously that's more involved, by just simply applying the default grouping function approach with regards to the functional unit. And the last point is precursor defined boundaries. So we'll look at a case study, I believe, on this. But for example, if you're sourcing from a blast furnace and an electric arc furnace, and then you're rolling those steel plates or sheets or coils into pipes, those have two very different emissions intensities if one's blast furnace precursor and one's electric arc furnace precursor, and therefore the cost profiles are also very different. If you can prove that you can trace that substrate origin through your site, then splitting out your functional unit based on the same commodity code but by the precursor origin is an additional kind of permitted exception with regards to these functional units. This is something we'll see pretty consistently, particularly from businesses that are in re-rolling or equivalent operations where there are significant deviations in the emissions intensities of their products. So obviously, the EU has given a lot of free rein to do what you want here, basically. They just want you to be able to prove that you know what you're doing. And so that's really where this verification question comes into play, is that are you really certain that if a verifier pulled out any product, you'd be able to prove exactly where the material came from, exactly what process emissions have been allocated to it. And if you can do that, then fantastic, you can report down to the specific lot or product level. And if you can't, then you have to work your way back in terms of understanding exactly what level of granularity you can go into with regards to your data. So this is probably one of the most important parts. Obviously, the commercial implications of how you define the functional unit matter significantly as well. And so it's very much worth taking in due consideration with regards to that approach, or which approach you select. So once we've defined our functional units, we can start to look at allocating and calculating emissions intensities and benchmarks. So we're going to start with benchmarks because interestingly, they help to, the two mechanisms are the same effectively. When you're calculating the emissions intensity, you're just allocating all of the emissions of the precursors and the process emissions, and then you're dividing it by the total volume that you produce, and that gives you the emissions intensity of your average product. And then the benchmark is exactly the same approach, but you're looking at understanding what the difference in what would have happened if those goods had been produced in the EU compared to what allocation needs to be considered with regards to those goods not being produced in the EU and therefore receiving a free allocation under the EU CBAM. So there's two types of goods here. There's simple goods, where effectively the benchmark under column A and column B in the legislation is the same. And it's the same because there's no precursors coming into these goods. So there's no deviation with regards to where that benchmark is set. And then the second is really with regards to complex goods, where you need to account for the free allocation that would have been received if those precursors have been made in the EU. In the exact same way, you then also account for your installation-specific free allocation had your installation been operating in the EU. So at the end of the day, when it comes to verification, we're looking at verifying both the emissions intensity and the benchmark calculation for your site. And so this is, one of the most complex parts for sure with regards to the calculation, particularly given it's only been a few months since the EU kind of released the methodology and the guidance, and there are lots of questions that remain outstanding with regards to which benchmarks you're allowed to use with regards to your installation, and how certain products go through processes, and which column A benchmarks you can assign with regards to the specific installations. So lots of questions, and we're going to give a little bit of an example here. So when we think about graphically showing the process of calculating both the emissions intensity and then the free allocation, what we can see here is, at the top you've got your precursor inputs. So if you think about it with regards to a given precursor, all of these precursors have a specific embedded emissions, which is this the full extent of the line. And when we look at it, we're looking to understand, okay, the emissions intensity, the tons of CO2 per ton, that's the total specific embedded emissions in that product. Of those embedded emissions, how much have already had a carbon price paid overseas? And then of that total emissions intensity, what would have received a free allocation had these goods been produced in the EU? And so this looks back to that first slide that we were originally reviewing at the start to understand the mechanism. So you can see in this case here, we've got our three precursors. Let's say they're all primary aluminium, and so they all receive the same benchmark associated with that column A, column B benchmark, depending on whether or not it's been verified. And then above that benchmark, all of these emissions are the ones that are in scope with regards to being above the free allocation and therefore having a full CBAM cost. And then above, and then we also, last but not least, have to account for any overseas carbon price that's paid on those goods. And so when we're calculating the emissions intensity, we would then take the ton per ton volume that's gone in to produce 1 ton of our output product, and we do the exact same process with regards to calculating the benchmarks. So we do the total mass of the precursors multiplied by their specific benchmark, and then we add our on-site specific process emissions. So in that example where we're a re-roller and we're taking in all these different sources of input materials, we also get to add our specific re-rolling emissions, so the on-site emissions associated with our re-rolling activities. And then we look at the commodity codes of the goods that we're producing, and we'd then be entitled to an additional column A benchmark that would feed into our calculation as well. So this is really where kind of the key deviation here with regards to understanding the value associated with the different precursors coming in, but also then our on-site emissions is really important to understand, because they're it makes a big difference to understand what our contribution as an installation is versus what the precursors are that feed into our calculations. The last thing to call out here is that if your emissions intensity of your product is below the benchmark, you don't get any negative allowance or allocation here. So it's only cascading where the emissions intensity exceeds the benchmark, but there's no deduction from that calculation if it's below the benchmark. Okay, so once we've then calculated, based on our functional units, our emissions intensity and our benchmark for the site, we then need to start to think about actual verification. And even if that's pre-verification, we should be in a position where we have all of the underlying data that feeds into our calculations, which includes the purchase logs, the lab testing, or any additional information with regards to calibration for our natural gas consumption and for our emissions factors tied to our input materials. Our method will be explained in the monitoring methodology for our site. And then the cascading verification piece is interesting, but we'll look at a case study shortly that shows why it's less important than many believe, very much depending on the geography. But if you are a complex goods producer, you're reliant on verified data coming down from your suppliers, but you can always use default values from your suppliers as in the intermediate step. So in order for your site to be verified, you do not need to have verified data from your supply chain. You can use defaults. Obviously, the expectation is that verified data is going to be less intense or less costly than having to use than having to use defaults. And so you want to kind of take a two-step approach with regards to verification. Make sure your site is able to be verified, and then wait as long as you can as you start to receive verified actual data back from your suppliers, and then finish off your verification, giving yourself enough time to make sure you're able to communicate to your customers in Europe so that they have enough time to do their own reporting, so that they can make sure that they meet that 30th of September deadline to use actual values in their declaration. And verification, as we've kind of touched on, is a significant exercise. So reasonable assurance is not limited assurance. It will be a full-on audit of the underlying data that's feeding into your calculations and all of the underlying methodology and context about your site. And there is a mandatory on-site visit in the first year of your verification. So all 50,000 installations that want to use actual values, if they want to be verified, there has to be an on-site visit from a verifier next year. In terms of that procedure, so obviously, as we mentioned, like the earlier you start that pre-engagement exercise, the faster you'll be able to be in a position to complete that verification. The verifiers will then take all that information, they'll define a verification approach, they'll look at the key risk areas that they want to target and test, they'll present a verification plan, they'll come on site, they'll execute that visit where they'll go through exactly what they want to understand, they'll potentially repeat some of the processes that you carry out on site, just to make sure that you actually are following the verification, the monitoring methodology that you define, and then they'll do some sampling and auditing with regards to certain input materials and certain sold products, as well as certain gas, electricity, meter readings, depending upon where the most material elements of the site are. There'll then be a review, they'll issue a report, and they will look at, they will provide three kind of different outputs with regards to that report. Either happy, verified, or there are unresolved misstatements that need to be reviewed, or they can't verify because you haven't that there isn't enough evidence or sufficient supporting material to give them reasonable assurance that there isn't any misstatement in this report. The key thing to call out here is there's two elements with regards to the verification. One is that there's a 5% threshold with regards to both the materiality approach for both the emissions intensity and the benchmarks. So if you have misstatements that are below 5%, then you don't necessarily need to reconcile them. You may just have them posted as a sum issue that's below the de minimis threshold. And the second point is, if you do fail verification, that doesn't mean you can't go through verification again. So it's worth remembering, why that timeline piece is so important, because if you can do a verification early in the year and fail, you still have the opportunity to go through verification later in the year. And so I just wanted to kind of call out a case study of a client that we've worked with that is a good example of why having a strong monitoring methodology and really understanding the allocation and the functional unit definitions of your site is important, and also commercially real now with regards to having the actual benchmarks and the actual defaults for the definitive phase. So this was a aluminium plate manufacturer, effectively a re-roller. They were taking in primary ingots, external slabs. They were producing their own slabs, and then they were producing their finished plates. And when we looked across the cost implications for them around verification, there are three scenarios here. On the left-hand side is this perfect world where both them and all their supply chain get verified, and you end up in a situation where you're paying 25 to 30 euros per ton on CBAM costs associated with their products going to Europe. Then there's this middle scenario where they can get verified. Everything that they do is fine, but none of their suppliers get verified, and they're forced to use default values for their precursors, which again is fine. You don't have to use actuals for your precursors. You can get verified under default values for those input materials. And that results in kind of 40 to 50 euros per ton costs for their site. And then there's the kind of worst case scenario where they fail verification, and it's regardless of what happens to their suppliers, they're forced to use the default values for that country of origin for their site, which results in them having to pay, or their customers having to pay 120 euros a ton for their products. And so when we look at this scenario, it's pretty obvious that verification for your site is just the table stakes when it comes to being able to offer competitive products under EU CBAM. Whether or not you can get your suppliers verified actually has a relatively limited, obviously in this case it was around 2 million euros, so non-insignificant, but the difference between you being verified and not being verified is a doubling in exposure and a more than doubling in exposure with regards to your site's materials going into Europe. So hopefully a good case study here with regards to exactly why verification is so fundamental if you are a non-EU installation, but also if you're an importer, you need to understand what that worst case default value looks like, and then effectively build out a spread associated with understanding what are the best case scenarios if they do get verified, if they can't get their supplier data verified but their site is still verified, and then what am I willing to take the risk on, and how can I use that to inform my conversations with my my suppliers with regards to, okay, if you are verified, then I'm willing to pay this price, but if you fail to be verified, then you have to take the risk associated with that increasing cost. And so a lot of the conversations and negotiations right now that we're seeing are tied to this. And really what these conversations boil down to is, do you have a monitoring methodology? Has someone looked over this data? How are you progressing with regards to pre-verification? Because if you can't answer those three questions, then you're very much looking like you're going to be in the red on the right-hand side of this graphic and not on the left-hand side. So again, this is where monitoring methodologies and verification really are a sort of fundamental part to making sure that you are able, as an installation, to confidently price your goods to your customers, knowing where you're likely to sit with within these three different kind of cost scenarios as a business. Fantastic. With that, I believe I'm done with the presentation. So thank you all for listening. And I'd just like to take a moment just to say thank you to the IACBAM team, to Marcel and JJ for all the work you guys are doing on this. It's a fantastic initiative, and it's been a pleasure to be involved and take part today. So I guess we can open up to questions.
Thank you, Nick. This was wonderful, really nice. All the time the word lighthouse is in my mind, like we're navigating everybody in the CBAM community to do the right thing. This is exactly why we do these webinar series, to make sure that everybody in the CBAM community understands what to do. But obviously, if they want to dive into their personal situation, they should reach out to you, and they probably can get a tailored advice. Would it be okay for you to share this on YouTube, or is that
Absolutely.
that would be great, because the content is amazing, but I can imagine for some people they want to rewatch it just to understand it step by step, and YouTube is perfect for that. I have received quite some questions in the Q&A. Can you see them?
Let me see if I can find it.
If you go to the 9 dots in the right bottom corner, that's where the Q&A is. But I'm not sure if you can see it.
Oh, I don't think I can see it. So
no?
Go ahead and ask.
Yeah, but I don't want to put you on the spot. But if there's a question, yeah, okay. So the first question here is it likely that ETS verifiers will be the first to become / join the list of EU CBAM verifiers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously, from the second half of this year, the accreditation process looks likely to begin. There's effectively a dual accreditation requirement, and if you're already based in the EU, accredited under the ETS as a verifier, then your ability to become an EU CBAM verifier is significantly reduced in terms of the administrative requirements. So what that means is EU-based verifiers currently under the ETS, verifiers under the ETS, they will very quickly become the first EU CBAM verifiers. The big question, as we talked about with regards to the rigor and the requirements under verification under CBAM, is to what extent the EU is going to play a game effectively with regards to non-EU based verifiers, because that dual accreditation would require them to both be registered as a verifier domestically and then also in the EU as well, and that could lead to some time delays and challenges with regards to that process. So yeah, definitely one to keep an eye on. But yeah, I think that if you're looking for a verification partner, existing EU ETS verifiers who have an objective to become EU CBAM verifiers are likely your safest bet.
Yeah. And my impression is that the verifiers are going to be quite strict, because they especially do not want to lose the license after having to do so much to get them. Do you have the same impression?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be very interesting to see. The liability is significant, right? Because you as a business will have a 5-year window in which you can kind of be found out for poor practices. So not only is it going to be strict with regards to issuing these verification statements, also it's first-year audits for every single site in many cases. And coming from a financial audit background, first-year audits are always the kind of messiest with regards to getting to grips with what these sites are, what your client or the business you're verifying is actually doing, and therefore particularly when you have this implication around the liability and the EU's ability to review numbers over the next 5 years, and to your point, potentially take away your license for failing that approach. Yes, it's going to be tricky, and you really want to make sure you build up a good foundation with regards to the data and the monitoring approach and those discussions with verifiers before they start that verification process for the first time, so it's not a complete blank state at the start.
Thanks for that. Another question, to what extent does the monitoring plan differ in terms of ISO 14067 and CBAM verification? Do you know that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So ISO 14067 on the product carbon footprint side. So
The question is more like, do they? It's continuous activity. Does it make sense to derive this monitoring plan from CBAM? Because a lot of people struggle with like, okay, how should I do the monitoring plan? Everybody is trying to find that information, and they want to start there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's two things that we generally see. One is, if you're doing product carbon footprint calculations, then fantastic. Like a lot of the context there will help because you're doing the allocations, you're doing the tracking of materials to a more kind of complete extent, given the scope of the product carbon footprints. Obviously, there's just nuances on CBAM with regards to specific, for example, natural gas has to be metered on a weekly basis, and various other components that you just need to be cognizant of that don't necessarily align 100% between ISO 14067 and then the CBAM requirements. But it's 100% a good place to start. And obviously, one of the other things we see is most businesses, in the manufacturing side, they have very good documentation around standard operating procedures. They've got process flow diagrams, and you will have an HSE or kind of like a efficiency related team member who will know all of the processes inside out. They'll be monitoring to, because of the commercial implications associated with efficiency on site, you'll likely have a very good grip of this information. And so, from a starting point, this is really where you can kickstart the monitoring methodology for your site.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any standard name for the CBAM methodology for verification? I don't know. I haven't heard any specific name for that, right? It's just CBAM.
Yeah, in terms of the monitoring methodology or the verification.
Yeah.
Just the CBAM monitoring methodology. Yeah.
Then Daniel's asking, when we receive verified and approved, I think that's the same data by a third party from our supplier, can we assume that the precursor data is also verified?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So in the verification statement, as far as we can see, based on what they will be submitting to the EU, it's likely that some of this information will have to be contained in that report. The kind of critical thing here is, even if it's not, you can probably infer based on the numbers. And so, the real question here is just going to be one around to what extent there is a kind of supply chain consideration around the sensitivity of data. So whether or not it's verified and approved, that will give you all you need to know as to whether or not your ability to use those numbers in your own calculation, whether it discloses information around the precursor data, will be tied, we presume, to kind of the willingness of the installation to share information, because in their site, particularly if they're a re-roller, they might want to make it clear that it's not their fault, for example, that they failed to obtain actual data and they're being forced to use defaults. But yeah, to be clear, the verification report that the verifier submits to the EU will contain all of this information, so all of the underlying precursor data, production processes. And this is one of the reasons why certain countries or certain jurisdictions are kind of questioning whether or not they will do verification, because there's some strategic information contained, or very secretive or security related information contained in these reports that they might not wish to be disclosed to the EU. But yeah, the verification statement you receive, it will tell you these are the verified numbers that you need to use in your report if you're downstream of that precursor. And when your verifier looks at your own numbers and they look at that precursor data and the verification statement, it doesn't matter whether it has defaults or actuals, provided it is verified by a third-party verifier, accredited third-party verifier.
Thanks. And in practice, I hear a lot of importers saying, oh, but our supplier will get verified, and we also know who is the steel mill, because since sometime we have to prove that the steel doesn't come from Russia. But if it's kind of a larger supply chain and there are companies in between, the moment when you do not have those two, let's say two producers in between verified, then you can't use the data of the steel mill, right? So that's actually that's usually where most of the emissions are.
Yeah, and obviously the other one there is, if you don't have good traceability or you can't prove the origin of the goods, then you'd be forced into using the default values for precursors, which are even more punishing than some of the kind of worst default values for specific countries of origin. So if you get to page 2400 of the default values legislation, then you'll find that precursor table, which again, is one that you definitely want to make sure you know the origin of the goods that you're consuming on site.
I was yesterday playing with Lego with my son, and I felt like giving him one block for the bottom and one for the top, and everything in the middle he couldn't use. And I say, let's build a tower. That's a little bit how the supply chain sometimes feel for importers. Next question. Will you share with us a recording of the webinar? Yes, we will give everybody the link so they can go to YouTube. We sometimes end up in spam with IACBAM, so please look into your spam if it ends up there. Our imports into, I think it's Northern Ireland, Netherlands. Our imports into Northern Ireland from outside EU and UK that remain in Northern Ireland come under EU CBAM now. Northern Ireland is always difficult, man.
Yeah, I probably won't give a direct answer to this, but if you've got clear evidence of them passing into the EU effectively, then you should be disclosing them. So where your exports from for example, like UK Ireland relations, so like where those goods are clearly being marked to go into free circulation into Ireland, then you should be disclosing them into Republic of Ireland. You should be disclosing them to the Irish NCA. Where they're going into Northern Ireland, like, as long as there's kind of context and content with regards to them not entering into free circulation into the EU effectively, then there is this kind of this is grey area, unfortunately, at the moment. Even the UK government hasn't kind of made any changes to the Windsor Agreement at the moment with regards to, or the Windsor Framework with regards to this piece. And there's constant conversations to try and provide some better clarity here. But if you are importing goods in the green lane, for example, and there's a clear evidence that they're going into free circulation in the EU, i.e. into Republic of Ireland, then yes, you should be making sure that there is disclosure going through the Irish NCA with regards to a declaration.
Spot on, great answer. There is no list of accredited verifiers released from CBAM yet. So for the pre-assurance, how do we know if the verifier is being accredited to do the verification?
Yeah, you would just need to ask them. So, obviously all of the kind of standard names, the SGSs, Prima Veritas, TVs, etc. They're based on conversations. They're all intending to go down the verification route on CBAM. So, if you want to understand what their intention is, then you should talk with them. I guess there's two kind of things that you should bear in mind. If you are an installation, pre-verification can be done by many different parties. It doesn't require you to be a verifier. You can just come in and review the numbers. We go in and do a lot of reviews and checks and basically verification readiness considerations, effectively a pre-verification. But in many cases, the installations themselves want to use the verification body, the verification entity that will ultimately do the verification for them as part of that when they're doing that pre-verification process. So really, it's a conversation that you would have with that entity. If you have an existing entity that you currently use for other verification exercises or other ISO reviews, then talk with them with regards to understanding their intention to go down that accreditation pathway.
Yeah, thanks. Still have a few minutes. This is an interesting one. What's your opinion regarding fasteners in between brackets, screws, nuts? Is it production part of process in scope or not?
Yeah, so if we go, if we just navigate back, so when we think about the fastener production process, right? If you're for argument's sake, if you're sort of an integrated, you're drawing wire and then you're producing the fasteners on site, then obviously like some of those processes such as wire drawing, for example, would be captured in terms of in the scope. But if you're heading and turning, etc., generally these are effectively finishing activities, but also they're generally only consuming producing indirect emissions, so through electric processes. So when you look at this list of what's included and not included, that's really the kind of determination there with regards to whether or not any of the activities, like if you're heat treating on site, for example, then these are kind of activities that would be captured under the scope. It's much better to be safer by doing the underlying defining a monitoring methodology, doing the calculations, and having a file for your site, because one of the key things, if you are a fastener producer, and just in general, if you're doing any finishing activities on a good, and therefore you are changing the commodity code of those goods, like, yes, these processes are out of scope, but actually the complex part for your installation is doing the precursor calculations and then allocating the emissions in those precursors to your finished product. The concept of then adding, some electricity emissions, like indirect emissions, by taking 12 meter readings over the course of the year, or whatever granularity of indirect emissions, electricity meters that you have, that exercise is pretty minimal compared with being able to prove to a verifier how you allocate the steel or aluminium rod or wire that you're bringing onto your site to then produce your fastener products. And if you are doing that conversion, you will need to be verified, because otherwise, you are the installation if you're producing fasteners and sending them into the EU. So your installation does need to be verified, regardless of whether or not there are any emissions being contributed from processes on your site to that final intensity of the products.
Yeah. When you started with this sheet, I was actually just approving some questions, so I might have missed it. But what I learned in the past month is that there's a discrepancy between the basic regulation and the implementing regulation. In the implementing regulation, they have some finishing products included, which are not in the basic regulation, and there's a massive inconsistency, and that's where a lot of fastener companies are, let's say, angry about. And the reason is because, if I'm correct, within the EU, if you do not output more than 20 megawatts, I think, on an annual basis, certain processes are not included, but they are included now in the implementing regulation, and that's a inconsistency. And what I find especially hard is that if you have to include those processes, where a lot of factories are not prepared for it, that would automatically mean you have to go for default values, what actually means your whole supply chain will end up with default values. And that is, for the fastener industry, a hard nut to crack, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not good. We still have 1 minute. One question. Raw steel used in does changing the customs procedure to outward processing have any impact on the calculation of CBAM embedded emission, compared to simply providing proof that the precursors originate from the EU?
Yeah, so EU origin precursors are out of scope with regards to the calculations. There was another question around what documentation is required to prove that. So yeah, either kind of a mill test or customs import data associated with that goods to show that they have an EU origin tied to them. And then yeah, in your calculation, you're effectively excluding them because they have zero embedded emissions and they contribute zero to the benchmark component with regards to your calculation. So yeah, just making sure you've got good documentation to prove that country of origin. For now, obviously, if you're talking about the UK-EU relationship, that's another question. But I think definitely for now, making sure that you've got a good grip on those two pieces of documentation, and then you can exclude them from your calculation, as long as it's, again, documented in the monitoring methodology on how and why you're doing that.
Thank you, Nick. Again, you're light in the dark for many people in the CBAM community. As IACBAM, we're very happy that you're with us. Thank you very much for this webinar. It has been very insightful. We're going to the end, so I'm going to share two last final sheets. You can see my screen now, right? Yeah. So on the 9th of April, we will have, also from the UK, Holly Piggott. She will talk about a different part of CBAM, especially UK customs and cross-border readiness. She is an expert on this topic, and she will provide the next webinar series. And just to end with, if you're interested, take a look at iacbam.org/summit for the Global CBAM Summit which is going to be a very interesting event held in Prague on the 28th. And Nick will be one of the main speakers over there, so you can meet him in real life. Okay, thank you all for joining, and hope to see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.